Hi guys, this is our first amphibian video on basics. By the end of this video you should be able to explain the evolutionary importance of amphibians, describe what makes an amphibian, outline their classification, and trace their evolution from sarcopterygians to list amphibians, and describe the three extant orders of amphibians and their basic characteristics. So, some basics about amphibians. The word amphibian comes from amphibios, which means double life, and that's because most amphibians have an aquatic stage and a terrestrial stage. There's lots of different life histories of amphibians, and we'll get more into those, but in general, aquatic stage, terrestrial stage. Amphibians were the first vertebrates on land, so they paved the way for the evolution of all terrestrial vertebrates, so that's an important point. There's about 5,000 known species of amphibians worldwide. Most of them are frogs. There's great diversity within those, and one way to see that diversity is looking at size. So there's goes from that tiniest frog that we talked about back in our very first vertebrates video up to this is a giant Chinese salamander. So this guy is less than a centimeter, something like 7 millimeters. This guy can be like 6 feet long. Amphibians have moist skin, and as we talked about earlier, that's because it's a way for them to breathe in many species, but that also makes them susceptible to environmental factors because lots of different chemicals can diffuse across their skin, and so for that reason amphibians often serve as indicator species because they're often affected earlier than other vertebrates by certain environmental factors. So what makes an amphibian an amphibian? They have smooth, moist, glandular skin, and you can see that in this diagram here of frog skin. In the glands, they can have mucus glands to keep their skin moist. They might also have poison glands depending on the species, and it releases like toxins on their skin to prevent predation. These amphibians, they don't have claws or scales or feathers or fur. They breathe through lungs, skin, or gills, and it can be a combination of those things, or it could be that in their aquatic phase, like this axolotl, they would breathe through gills, and then when they become more terrestrial, then they would breathe through lungs/skin. Amphibians are mostly tetrapods, meaning they walk on 4 limbs, but there are some exceptions. There's a whole order that doesn't have any limbs, but in general they have a bony skeleton. As we talked about at the beginning of the semester, they have a 3-chambered heart and double circulation, so blood goes back to the heart twice, right? It goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen, back to the heart, then out to the body, and back to the heart. Amphibians can both hear and smell, so they have a tympanum, and that you can see really well in this picture here, just like our eardrum really, but it's exposed. They also have an olfactory epithelium, and that allows them to smell, and you can see they have nostrils for smelling. These guys are ectothermic, meaning if their temperature is regulated by the environment, and in general they have webbed feet. Sometimes you see it more than others, depending on the degree of aquaticness. Their classification, so the first 3 levels is same as always for vertebrates, right? Kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata. All amphibians are in the class Amphibia, and then there's only one extant subclass. So if you look on this diagram over here, we have class Amphibia. There's 2 subclasses, but this one is now fully extinct. There's no currently living species from that subclass, so there's really just the one subclass, List Amphibia, and 3 orders within that subclass, and these are the 3 that we're going to talk about. There's this other order, but it is also extinct, so these are the 3 extant orders. And the Anura is the frogs and toads, Caudata is salamanders and newts, and Gymnophiona is the Caecilians. Talk more about those. So amphibian evolution, remember when we talked about fish and we talked about the sarcopterygians and the actinopterygians? The sarcopterygians were those fish that were like the lobe-fin fish or the lungfish and the coelacanths, the really kind of primitive fish. And these guys are the ancestors to amphibians. So you can see on this diagram here, you've got the sarcopterygian fish, and then there's different branchings that happen along the way. But about 100 million years ago, the lissamphibians diverged into these three groups: the anurans, which are the frogs and toads, salamanders, the caudata, and the caecilians. And you can see in this diagram down here the homologous structures between those lobe-finned fish or the sarcopterygian fish, where they had fins that allowed them to swim, but bones developed into those fins that helped them also to walk. And then in the amphibians, you see that it looks very similar. You have the similar bones there, similar bone structure, but it's primarily now for walking. So let's look at these three orders really briefly. We're going to go into each of these three orders in more depth. But just to give you an idea of the three, caudata is the salamanders, and that name caudata means bearing a tail. So these are the only amphibians that really have a tail as adults. There's about 400 species of these worldwide, and so they have 4 limbs and a tail. And with these guys, with salamanders, the 4 limbs are pretty much the same size and shape. All 4 of them are. They can have mucus and poison glands. So can frogs and toads. Order Anura is the frogs and toads. There are lots of these guys. About 4,500 species worldwide. They also have 4 limbs, but the limbs are unequal size. The back limbs are bigger for jumping. Anurans are more widespread than salamanders, and in this order the males will vocalize when they're breeding. So we're actually going to learn the calls of some of the species within Anura. And the final order is Gymnophiona, and these are the caecilians, and that name, caecilian, means without legs. And these guys, as you can see down here, this ultra creepy picture of one, they don't have any arms or legs, no limbs, and they live underground. They're diggers, and they live mainly in the subtropics and tropics, about 150 species, and you can see here a lot of times you don't even see their eyes. That's something that's become more kind of vestigial for them because they live underground, and so the need for sharp eyesight is diminished. So make sure you can go back and you have notes on each of these points. And then I want to leave you with this. I hope that that in the next couple weeks you see how cool amphibians can be. But if you don't think that the frogs and salamanders are cool amphibians, you must think that this is a cool amphibian. This is a it's called a Gibbs quad ski, and so it's like a four-wheeler that you can also ride as a jet ski, and it only costs like $50,000. So we should probably all go get one. I'll see you in class.